At 6:44 a.m., over the northern Persian Gulf at 31,000 feet, a KC-135R stratotanker from the 341st Expeditionary Air Refueling Squadron was completing the handoff of its fourth fuel offload of the morning shift. The boom operator in his prone station at the aircraft's rear watching the receiver aircraft, an F-35A, disconnect cleanly and bank away south toward its next target set over Iran. The tanker had been airborne since 2 a.m. It carried, in the fuel tanks integrated into its wings and fuselage, the organizational asset that made the entire air campaign possible. The aviation fuel that allowed fighter aircraft to fly to targets in Iran, drop their weapons, and return without the range constraints that would otherwise confine American air power to the Gulf coastline. Without the tanker fleet holding its refueling orbits over the Gulf, the campaign's reach collapsed. A B-1B flying from Diego Garcia could not reach the Iranian plateau and return without multiple aerial refueling contacts. An F-35A flying a deep suppression mission into central Iran's defended airspace was planning its fuel margin to the gallon. The tanker orbits were the circulatory system of the air campaign, invisible infrastructure, unremarked upon in the strike reports and the battle damage assessments, present in every mission that involved an aircraft flying more than 100 miles from its base. The IRGC Aerospace Force had understood this for years. The analysis that had produced the anti-tanker operation had been completed in the second month of the conflict, when the pattern of aerial refueling orbits over the northern Gulf had become routine enough that a systematic study of American tanker operations, using a combination of commercial flight tracking data, the acoustic signatures of tanker aircraft picked up by the IRGC's coastal listening network, and the inference from strike package timing of when and where the refueling contacts were occurring, had produced a targeting picture of sufficient confidence for the operation to be planned. The IRGC's analysis had concluded that destroying 3 or 4 KC-135s in a single engagement would not stop the campaign. The campaign had sufficient tanker redundancy for that. What destroying 3 or 4 KC-135s would do was force a fundamental change in the tanker orbits, moving them farther from Iran, deeper into the Gulf, compressing the range from which fighters could operate, and reducing the time on target that the deep strike aircraft had over the most defended parts of Iranian territory. The anti-tanker operation was not designed to stop the campaign. It was designed to degrade it. The weapons assigned to the operation were the IRGC's surviving long-range surface-to-air missile systems, specifically the 3 S-300PMU2 batteries that Iran had acquired from Russia in 2016 and that represented the most capable air defense weapons in the Iranian inventory. The S-300PMU2 carries the 48N6E3 interceptor missile, a weapon capable of engaging targets at ranges of up to 240 kilometers and at altitudes that encompass the entire operating envelope of any American aircraft in the theater. The 3 batteries had survived 3 weeks of Operation Epic Fury's systematic destruction of Iranian air defense infrastructure by virtue of their mobility. The S-300 is a road mobile system whose survival in a contested environment depends on its ability to move frequently and unpredictably, to emit rarely and briefly, and to exploit the terrain masking of Iran's western mountain ranges to prevent American passive collection from building the persistent location track that would end in a harm engagement. The batteries had moved an average of once every 41 hours since the conflict began. They had survived not because they were hidden, but because they were never still long enough to be confidently targeted. The anti-tanker operation required them to be still. A moving battery cannot engage. An S-300 battery conducting a long-range engagement against a target at 200 kilometers must be stationary, must have its radar in full emission, and must hold that configuration for the 12 to 20 seconds required to track the target and achieve guidance lock on the interceptor. The IRGC's operational planners had built the anti-tanker concept around a compressed engagement window,
all three batteries would acquire their pre-assigned tanker targets simultaneously, fire within a 4-second window, and immediately begin their displacement sequences after the missiles were away. The radar exposure time would be minimized. The total time from first emission to last round away would be less than 30 seconds. In the planner's calculation, 30 seconds of S-300 emission was an acceptable risk.
The calculation had failed to account for what the passive collection architecture knew about those three S-300 batteries at 6:44 a.m. The IRGC's battery commanders had been told, through their operational security protocols, to maintain radio silence and minimize movement in the 72 hours before the operation. The instruction was sound. Unnecessary movement creates observation opportunities. Unnecessary communications create intercept opportunities. The instruction had been followed. The three batteries had been stationary for 61, 58, and 64 hours, respectively, when the launch window arrived. 61 hours of a stationary S-300 battery is, in the language of the targeting analysts at Al Udeid, who had been watching the passive signatures and the positional indicators that accumulate even from a system that is trying very hard not to be found. A battery that has been located with high confidence. The RC-135 rivet joint had been orbiting the Iranian plateau since the previous day's late afternoon, its passive collection sensors building the picture that the pre-operation radio silence had not fully suppressed. The residual signals from the battery's power generation systems, the brief navigation radar emissions from the transport vehicles that supported each battery, the pattern of life indicators of a military unit that had been in one place for 2.5 days and had necessarily made the routine daily activities that military units make. The targeting confidence for all three batteries was assessed at 81% or higher at 5:30 a.m. The targeting confidence was sufficient for authorization. The specific trigger was not that the batteries had been located, it was the operational pattern assessment. At 11 p.m. the previous evening, an encrypted burst transmission on a frequency associated with IRGC Aerospace Force Command communications had been registered by the RC-135. The transmission lasted 0.4 seconds. Its content was not decrypted. Its timing, 0.4 seconds on a command frequency after 60 hours of silence from that frequency, was sufficient in the assessment of the analyst who flagged it at 4:22 a.m. to indicate that the batteries had received an operational order and that their employment was imminent. The analyst noted the three battery positions, the confidence levels, the transmission event, and her assessment of what it meant. She sent it to the operations cell. The operations cell called the Command Authority. The Command Authority authorized the response package at 5:11 a.m. 7 minutes later, 4 F-22. As with HARM missiles were on their way to orbit positions that would be occupied before the batteries activated. At 5:18 a.m., 4 F-22A Raptors had launched from Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE and were climbing to their patrol altitude over the northern Gulf. Not on a standard air dominance patrol. Carrying AGM-88E advanced anti-radiation missiles loaded to their internal weapons bays, an unconventional loadout for the F-22, which is not typically configured for the SAD mission because its low observable design is optimized for air-to-air combat. The reason the F-22 had been selected for this specific mission was precisely its low observable profile. The mission required an aircraft that could position itself within the optimal engagement envelope of the AGM-88E against all three S-300 batteries simultaneously and wait, potentially for hours, for the moment when the batteries activated their radars and provided the electromagnetic emissions that the HARM needed to home on. A conventional SEAD aircraft positioned that close to three active S-300 batteries would be detected by the battery's own search radar and could be engaged before it completed its mission. An F-22 in its low observable configuration, at the altitudes and positions where its radar cross-section was minimized, could orbit within range and remain undetected for as long as required. The 4 F-22s had been orbiting in their pre-planned positions since 5:47 a.m. One aircraft assigned to each of the 2 S-300 batteries in the western position, one to the northern battery, one to the southernmost battery. Their passive sensors were accumulating the pre-emission indicators from the battery positions below, waiting for the S-300's acquisition radar to light. They waited. There is a quality to this kind of waiting that is specific to the combat aviation mission in a way that is difficult to convey to anyone who has not experienced it. The F-22 pilot assigned to the northern battery position had been airborne since 5:18 a.m. He had flown his aircraft to its designated patrol position, configured his sensors, and begun the work of simply being present in the sky, at the right place, at a sufficient low observable altitude, to remain undetected by any surface sensor that might be watching. He was not patrolling in the conventional sense. He was waiting, with the full weight of his aircraft's systems and his own trained awareness, for a single event: the activation of an S-300 acquisition radar. When it happened, his job would take approximately 11 seconds. For the time before it happened, his job was to be ready. He had been ready since 5:47 a.m. He would be ready until his fuel required him to leave or the engagement occurred, whichever came first. The S-300 battery commanders had, in the design of the operation, 30 seconds before their own missiles would be away and their radars could go dark. They had 11. At 6:44 a.m., when the KC-135R was disconnecting from the F-35A over the northern Gulf, the IRGC's western battery activated its Big Bird acquisition radar. The 64N6E2 radar, a massive rotating array, whose emissions are unmistakable at any range to any passive collection system that has been profiled against the S-300 family, came to full power at 6:44 a.m. and 3 seconds. 3 seconds later, the northern battery's radar activated. The southernmost battery followed at 6:44 a.m. and 11 seconds. The coordinated activation was exactly what the IRGC's operation called for. 3 radars simultaneously acquiring their pre-assigned tanker targets. The passive sensor display in the F-22 assigned to the western battery lit with the S-300 acquisition radar's signature at 6:44 a.m. and 3 seconds, the same second the radar activated. No detection lag, no processing delay. The AGM-88E's seeker had been in its standby acquisition mode since the aircraft reached its patrol position at 5:47 a.m. The pilot had the radar emission in his passive sensor picture within a single scan cycle of the radar's own rotation. His targeting solution updated automatically. He did not need to maneuver. He was already in the envelope. He fired at 6:44 a.m. and 9 seconds, 6 seconds after the S-300 radar activated. The 2 F-22s covering the western battery fired within those 6 seconds. The F-22 on the northern battery fired at 6:44 a.m. and 12 seconds. The 4th F-22 fired at 6:44 a.m. and 14 seconds. 4 HARM missiles in the air within 11 seconds of the first S-300 radar activation. The S-300 battery operators had, in the design of the operation, 30 seconds before their own missiles would be away and their radars could go dark. The HARM missiles were traveling at Mach 2.5. From the F-22 orbital positions to the battery radar positions, the flight time was between 14 and 19 seconds, depending on the individual engagement geometry. The S-300 battery's own missiles, the 48N6E3 interceptors aimed at the KC-135 tankers, were not yet fired. The batteries were still in their acquisition and track phase when the HARM missiles arrived at 6:44 a.m. and 23 seconds, 6:44 a.m. and 27 seconds, and 6:44 a.m. and 31 seconds. 3 separate detonations. 3 S-300 acquisition radars rendered inoperable. The battery's fire control radars, whose activation followed the acquisition radar's lock-on in the normal engagement sequence, had not yet activated. No 48N6E3 missile had been fired. The tankers had not known they were targeted. The southern battery's harm impact was the most consequential in terms of secondary effects. The 48N6E3 interceptor missiles that the battery had been loading into its launch canisters in preparation for the strike, missiles that were fueled, armed, and in the process of being transferred from their transport vehicles to the launch positions, were within the harm warhead's fragmentation envelope. 2 of the fueled interceptors were struck by fragments. Both detonated. The sympathetic detonation of 2 48N6E3 missiles on the ground, with their solid rocket motors igniting and their warheads activating, produced a fireball that was visible from the KC-135R at 31,000 feet over the Gulf, a distant orange bloom against the haze above the Iranian mountains, brief and brilliant and then gone, leaving a column of dark smoke rising into the morning sky. The battery was not merely radar destroyed, it was comprehensively eliminated. At 6:44 a.m. and 35 seconds, 32 seconds after the first S-300 radar activation, all 3 IRGC Aerospace Force S-300 batteries were inoperable. No tanker had been struck. The KC-135R's boom operator, still watching the F-35A bank away south, had not heard a missile warning. The aircraft had not taken evasive action. The threat had been addressed in the window between the threat's first emission and its ability to complete the engagement cycle. The tanker orbits did not move, but the operation was not complete. The destruction of the 3 S-300 battery radars addressed the immediate threat. The IRGC Aerospace Force's anti-tanker capability, however, was not limited to the 3 S-300 batteries. The Tor M1 short-range batteries that had been supplementing the S-300OS in a tactical layering role, the Bavar 373 fire control system that represented the domestically produced Iranian long-range air defense capability, and, most immediately, the battery support vehicles and reloads that could potentially restore the S-300 batteries to partial capability if their electromechanical systems survived the harm strikes, were all present in the operational area and required systematic engagement. The operation was designated Copper Wall. The EA-18G Growler section that had been orbiting at altitude over the Gulf since 5:30 a.m., positioned ahead of the F-22's arrival in the operational area, their passive sensors complementing the F-22's collection, activated their jamming suites at 6:44 a.m. and 35 seconds, the moment the last harm detonation was confirmed. The jamming targeted the IRGC Aerospace Force's battle management frequencies, the communications channels through which the destroyed batteries would report their status, through which the command authority would attempt to activate any surviving air defense assets in the area, and through which any remaining Tor M1 batteries in the operational radius would receive engagement orders. The batteries that had not yet been activated were denied the command that would have brought them into the fight. Harm missiles addressed the 2 Tor M1 batteries, whose positions had been cataloged through the rivet joint's passive collection at 6:46 a.m. and 6:47 a.m. respectively. The Tor M1's Scrum Half Guidance Radar provided a clear homing signal for the AGM-88E. Both batteries were rendered inoperable within 90 seconds of the S-300 engagement.
The Bavar 373, Iran's domestically developed long-range air defense system, positioned at a site northeast of Bushehr that had been tracked for 22 days, was addressed by a dedicated strike element. 2 F-35As carrying GBU-31 JDAM bombs configured for the above-ground launcher and radar infrastructure of the system. The Bavar 373's engagement control radar had activated at 6:45 a.m., its operators apparently attempting to compensate for the S-300 losses by bringing the Bavar system into the engagement. The radar activation updated the targeting solution from the cataloged position to a confirmed active position. The F-35As had been orbiting in a position south of the Gulf that had been specifically chosen to allow engagement of the Bavar site with a GBU-31 attack profile if the opportunity materialized. The opportunity materialized at 6:45 a.m. The F-35 As were cleared hot at 6:45 a.m. and 12 seconds. The GBU-31 impacts at the Bavar 373 site were confirmed at 6:46 a.m. and 40 seconds. The system's radar was destroyed. The launcher vehicles were assessed as catastrophically damaged by the blast and fragmentation pattern. The support and rearm infrastructure that sustained the three S-300 batteries, the propellant tankers, the missile transporter vehicles carrying the reload 48N6E3 rounds, the maintenance vehicles, the generators, and the command post vehicles that had been parked at varying distances from the battery positions when the harm strikes occurred, was addressed by the F-35A and F/A 18F package that launched from Al Dhafra and the USS Harry S. Truman beginning at 6:48 a.m. The targeting data for the support vehicles had been accumulated through the rivet joint's passive collection of the vehicle movement signatures over the preceding 60 hours. The tracking confidence on the primary support vehicles was high enough for the targeting cell to assign GBU-39 small diameter bombs with specific vehicle-level coordinates. The engagement ran from 6:56 a.m. to 7:09 a.m. 22 individual vehicle targets addressed across the 3 battery support areas, 17 confirmed as total losses of asset, 5 assessed as damaged but potentially recoverable. Those 5 were re-engaged by a second GBU-39 allocation at 7:14 a.m. Final assessment, all 22 support vehicles rendered inoperable. At 7:19 a.m., 35 minutes after the first S-300 radar had activated, the Copper Wall post-strike preliminary assessment was transmitted to the CAOC. All 3 S-300PMU2 batteries rendered inoperable. Both Tor M1 batteries rendered inoperable. The Bavar 373 fire control radar destroyed. 22 support vehicles engaged. The IRGC Aerospace Force's long-range surface-to-air missile capability in the Persian Gulf approach corridor, the capability that had been specifically preserved and maintained through 3 weeks of the air campaign precisely for the purpose that had just been attempted, had been eliminated in a 35-minute window that had begun with the first S-300 radar activation and ended with the last GBU-39 impact. The KC-135RS continued their refueling orbits over the northern Gulf, the same orbits they had flown every day of the campaign, the same altitudes, the same geographic positions, the same timing patterns that the IRGC's anti-tanker planning had spent 6 weeks studying and targeting. There was no reason to move the orbits now. The threat that had been designed to force the orbits to move was gone. The campaign's circulatory system was intact, operating at its standard tempo, sustaining the strike aircraft that were at that moment completing their morning missions and heading back toward the tanker contacts that would enable them to return to their bases and prepare for the afternoon cycle. 3 S-300 batteries had activated their radars at 6:44 a.m. The last harm round had been fired 11 seconds later. The tankers had not heard a warning tone. The boom operators had not looked up from their stations. The receivers had not broken contact. The refueling had continued without interruption throughout the entire engagement. The campaign continued without interruption. The fuel continued to flow. The aircraft continued to fly. The 4 F-22 pilots who had orbited for 57 minutes waiting for 11 seconds of work returned to Al Dhafra and landed. The aircraft were refueled. The weapons bays were restocked. The aircraft were turned for the next mission. The pilots ate breakfast. The boom operator on the KC-135R, who had never known that 3 S-300 batteries had activated their targeting radars on his aircraft at 6:44 a.m., continued his shift. His aircraft made 2 more fuel offloads before returning to base at 11:30 a.m.
He filed his airtime log, noted that the shift had been routine, and went to the debrief. In the architecture of modern air warfare, the tanker orbit is the thread that holds the entire tapestry together. The IRGC had spent 6 weeks planning to cut that thread in 30 seconds. The thread held for 11 seconds more than it took to answer them.